For the folks that are on, we will get started shortly. If you have any questions, please make sure you enter those in the chat box, not Q&A. We will be monitoring the chat box. I can't promise I will get to all of the Q&A. It's a little tricky to use. We will start in just a couple of minutes. Oh, Bill answered that one. And Heather, just slides will be available for this as well, correct?
Yes, yes, I will. We will send out the slides to everyone. So.
Okay. We've had like 100 people join within the last minute, so once it starts slowing down, we'll.
Jill?
Yes, ma'am.
Have you pushed the recording button yet?
I have.
Thank you.
We've been recording for almost 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
Looks like it's slowing down some, Christy. Are you ready?
I absolutely am. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you for all of you being with us today. I'm Christy Paling, the Regional Coordinator for the Upper Cumberland Region with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. For those new to TCCY, the regional coordinators typically host learning events in our regions. With the current restrictions in place, we explored new ways to offer educational events to members and friends. So we are so pleased to offer this virtual training today. With nearly 900 people expected on the WebEx today, you will be muted so we do not experience any WebEx interference or any audio interference. Also, this training will be recorded. Jill Stott, our Northeast Regional Coordinator, will be monitoring the chat box, and you will periodically see some information to you from Jill. Please type in any questions you may have in the chat box. Please use the chat box versus the Q&A box, and also address those to the host. Jill will be reading those questions out loud during Q&A pauses during the training for those who may be joining us by phone. We will do our best to get to as many questions as time allows. Certificates of participation and NASW CEU certificates will be emailed out to you next week. Time and attendance will be monitored for CEU certificates as requirements dictate full participation. A special note to all of those calling into the training. If you need a participant or a CEU certificate, please email me, Christy Paling, at christy.paling@tn.gov, and please let me know your name and your telephone number so that we can be sure to capture your participation. At this time, I would like to introduce Richard Kennedy, our Executive Director, to share a few words. Richard.
Thank you, Christy. As Christy said, my name is Richard Kennedy, and I have the great privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Commission on Children and Youth. The Commission on Children and Youth is an independent state agency that serves as the broad-based children's advocacy organization in the state of Tennessee. The mission of the Commission is to advocate to improve the quality of life for children and families, and to provide leadership and support for child advocates across the state. Our vision is that all children in Tennessee are safe, healthy, educated, nurtured and supported, and engaged in activities that provide them with opportunities to achieve their fullest potential. At the Commission on Children and Youth, we work in a variety of fields. Our work ranges from a young child wellness council that's focused on the youngest Tennesseans birth to age 3 or 4, all the way to a youth transitions advisory council focused on improving outcomes for children aging out of the foster care system or the juvenile justice system, and everything in between, ranging from home visiting to juvenile justice to children's mental health. So we're very appreciative that you all are taking the time to be with us today. Most undoubtedly, many of you are familiar with our regional councils on children and youth and the 9 regional coordinators across the state. Their work is varied and their goals are many, but one of the important aspects of their work is to really connect folks in their regions for educational opportunities, to share new information, best practices, or to really look at gaps in services in that particular region of the state and coordinate with people to address those gaps. I want to thank all of the regional coordinators for their ability to be nimble during these unusual times, and really for the silver lining of using technology to provide training for folks all across the state and the country. In the state, ranging from Memphis to Mountain City and from Union City to Ducktown. So thank you for our regional coordinators for that work. During this time, like many of you, I think that I have utilized and have been on social media way too much. But one of the quotes that I've seen lately that are just really resonating with me is a Mr. Rogers quote. And I'm sure some of you have seen it, but it says, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" So I want to take this opportunity to personally thank each of you who are on the call for all of the things that you do to help. The big things that you do with your job, whether you're an educator and checking in on your students, whether you're a home visitor and you're using technology to stay in touch with your families, whether you're a court person and you're really looking at that fine line of providing services and treatment for young folks and balancing that with community safety. I just want to thank you all for that. And thank you especially for balancing all of the extra stress in your life with providing for your families and those that you love, in addition to the people that you work with. So thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Heather Herman is becoming quickly a dear friend of the Commission on Children and Youth. She has done multiple WebEx trainings for us, and as you will see throughout our time together, is just a stellar presenter. So Heather is the statewide domestic violence fatality review coordinator with the Metropolitan Nashville Office of Family Safety, and today she's going to be talking with us about the effects of trauma on the brain and body. So thank you, Heather, for taking the time to once again spend another day with us. And at this point, I'll turn things over to you.
All right. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you all being with us today. So as Richard mentioned, I work out of the Metro Nashville Office of Family Safety. The Office of Family Safety is a department of Metro government. Just like Parks is a department, or the health department, or any other department of local government, we coordinate Nashville's response to domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. And we also coordinate and house 2 different family justice centers within Nashville-Davidson County. One of those is the Gene Crow Advocacy Center, which is our court-based center. And the other is our Family Safety Center, which is our community-based center, which also houses, among many other wonderful partners, the Nashville Children's Alliance, which is Nashville's Child Advocacy Center, and the Department of Children's Services. And so the purpose of those family justice centers, if you're not familiar with the model, is to bring together all of the entities that work with and for victims of violence under one roof to collaborate, cooperate with each other, and all be there for victims as they come in. So someone who is coming into our center may receive advocacy, safety planning, help with an order of protection, They may spend an hour with their therapist, as well as speak to the detective or district attorney on their case, and any number of other agencies that are under our roof, such as housing, domestic violence shelters, and others. And so if you're interested in the work of my department or my work, particularly as a fatality review coordinator, which is a statewide project, I encourage you to get in touch. I am always happy to chat with folks and answer any questions that you have, and provide you with any resources that I can. And my contact information will be at the end of the PowerPoint, and as already mentioned, you will be receiving a copy of today's slides, so you will have all of that information. So today we are going to be talking about the impact of trauma on the brain and body, explore the ways that survivors' brains and bodies are impacted by trauma and the compounding impacts of repeated or chronic stress, the ways that trauma is expressed through behavioral and physical symptoms, the ways that trauma can impact a survivor's access to services, and we're going to talk about some ways to use a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach within your professional or personal roles. So let's get started. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the immediate experience of trauma. And some of what I'm going to get into is some detailed information about brain and body symptoms. And while I'm going to try very hard not to kind of belabor the biology lesson, I do think it's really important to talk about the way that fear and violence and trauma really impacts us mentally and physically, because many of those things are both out of our control and extraordinarily impactful in terms of the way that we experience and heal from trauma. So what is trauma? That is the most important question. Trauma can come in many, many forms. You know, for me in my field, when I'm talking about trauma, I am typically talking about the experience of some kind of interpersonal violence, whether that is domestic abuse, stalking, human trafficking, child abuse and neglect, or sexual assault. But trauma can be many things. A car crash can be a traumatic event. Living through the tornadoes like we had in Middle Tennessee earlier this year can be an extraordinarily traumatic event. Being in active combat as a part of our military can be an experience of trauma. So many, many things can be trauma. And the important thing to note is that trauma is at its root a subjective experience. So you and I may go through the exact same potentially traumatic experience and come out the other side with two very different responses. So let's go back to the example of a car accident. If you and I are in two different cars that crash into each other, and let's say that we have identical experiences in terms of the way that the cars crumple, our physical injuries, everything is identical. You and I may come out the other side of that crash with very different responses. I may be someone who was extraordinarily traumatized by that event and I may be afraid to drive or even ride in cars for a period of time afterwards, whereas you may step out of that event, shrug it off, shake it off, after the immediate kind of adrenaline rush settles. You may be perfectly fine to get back on the horse, so to speak. Everyone reacts and internalizes potentially traumatic events differently. And if you are interested in more depth on these topics, one of the best books on the subject is what this quote is pulled from. It's called The Body Keeps Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma by Bessel van der Kolk. And yes, the question, could a divorce or separation be a traumatic event for a child? Absolutely. Things like separation and divorce, if you're familiar with the adverse childhood experiences scale, all of the items on the adverse childhood experience survey are potentially traumatic. So a divorce in childhood, having a parent have drug or alcohol problems, having a parent with a severe mental illness, all of those things can cause potential trauma. And the thing that I love about this book and this quote in particular is that it understands that trauma is a fundamentally changing someone's mind and body. We can heal from trauma, but in the aftermath of trauma, our energy becomes focused on suppressing the traumatic responses that are happening within our brains and body, and pulls us away from many of the normal day-to-day operations of living our lives. And trauma over time can result in a whole range of physical symptoms: fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, chronic pain syndromes, autoimmune diseases. If the trauma involves sexual assault or child molestation, it can cause things like reproductive health issues, chronic migraines, all sorts of things that we'll dig deeper into as we move forward. Individual trauma results from an event or series of events or circumstances experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful. And it's important to note as well that you do not have to be the one who experiences the traumatic event to be affected by the trauma of it. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if you are a child who never witnesses but knows that your parent was physically abused. If you are a parent who finds out that your child has been sexually abused or molested, if you are a caregiver, an advocate, or someone who works with those who have experienced trauma, just the act of hearing those stories over and over and over, excuse me, over and over during your day-to-day functioning can be traumatic and can cause symptoms of trauma. In that case, we call it a secondary traumatization. Over half of adults in the United States report that they've experienced at least one lifetime traumatic event, and 90% of clients who engage in public behavioral health care have experienced trauma. which is a huge number when you think about it. Consider that 51% of women and 61% of men have experienced some kind of trauma, and then consider how many people you think of as close friends or family members, and do the math. It means that you inevitably know more than one person who has experienced a traumatic event of some kind. The consequences of trauma and the impact of trauma vary greatly depending on the nature of the trauma, the age of the victim, internal and external responses and support. So am I a person who is internalizing a lot of self-blame and shame? Then I'm going to be impacted very differently than someone who is processing my emotions in a more healthy and less shame-based way. And what is the external response? Do I have a good and healthy support system outside myself, or am I also experiencing shame or blame, or just don't have a support system to lean on at all? Additionally, your previous trauma history and experiences. So are you someone who has experienced trauma before in life? Are you someone who's experienced similar traumatizations? That can have a huge impact on how you process and internalize and respond to trauma. So a lot of factors here that can impact the ways in which we respond to an individual event that could be potentially traumatizing. And it's important to note as well that trauma responses in general and post-traumatic stress in particular may be especially severe or especially long-lasting when the stressor, the triggering event, was of human design. So abuse, rape, torture, war are going to be much longer lasting impacts than things like tornadoes, floods, acts of God. And so when we experience trauma, our experience of that event, trauma, fear, pain, it begins within our brains. Our brains is the control center of our nervous system, and it regulates everything from our body temperature to our digestion. And so when our brain is impacted, it impacts a whole host of other bodily symptoms. So there's a few parts of the brain that we're really going to dig into today, and I don't expect you in the aftermath of this to remember all of these pieces and parts. But again, this is something that I think is both interesting and important to kind of start to really understand the toll that trauma can take on individuals. So the parts of the brain that are going to be important are the brain stem, or the reptilian brain, which is in brown in this little chart, the limbic system, which is in red, and the cortex, which is in blue. So the cortex is the newest in developmental language. It's the newest part of your brain. It's the last part of your brain to mature as you age. It is the center of decision-making, cognitive and emotional responses, cause and effect, your understanding of consequence, your understanding of time, all of that stuff. The amygdala, which is part of that red limbic system, is the emotional computer and alarm system of your brain. The hippocampus stores memories and is a memory encoding system. And the hypothalamus releases hormones and regulates things like body temperature and physiological cycles. The thalamus translates for your brain. So it takes in all of the input from around you, the sights, sounds, smells, and translates that into something that your brain can understand. And it works closely with that alarm system of your amygdala. And so when you're boiling down your brain to those three regions, one of the easiest ways to remember that is what we call the hand model of the brain. And I am going to stop sharing for just a second so you can hopefully see my video so that you can see what I'm talking about. So when you have your hand and you're doing the hand model of the brain, your wrist and your arm are the brain stem. You curl your thumb to the inside of your palm. Your thumb becomes your representation of your limbic system. And then you fold your fingers down, and that's your frontal cortex. So that's a very easy way to both explain and remember what we're talking about when we're talking about all these different pieces and parts. Here we go. So when you process a threat, and for an example, I'm going to use something that has happened to me on, embarrassingly, more than one occasion. In my apartment, my refrigerator is old and terrible, and I have an equally old and terrible ice machine in the freezer. And when I first moved into my apartment, I did not realize the nature of the old and terrible refrigerator and ice machine. And so the first night that I was here, I was, I'd spent a long day moving and unpacking, and I was trying to get to sleep, and all of a sudden I hear like this unbelievable just clatter sound coming from inside my apartment. And at first I thought, okay, it's fine. Something probably fell from like the boxes I haven't unpacked yet. And I walked around. I didn't see anything, didn't find anything, but I told myself, it's fine. It's something, And then a couple hours later, it happened again. The same sound, the same clattering, and I could feel my heart pounding. I froze. I was terrified. Like, something is in here. Someone is living in my walls, worst case scenario immediately. So what happens in your brain when your body recognizes a threat? You hear the loud ice machine, which is what I later discovered that it was, and your thalamus, remember, the thing that's pulling in all of that information, it sends this up to your amygdala, and your amygdala, just like your alarm system on your house, recognizes a threat, sets off an alarm. Everything in your body is on high alert because something bad is happening. And your amygdala activates what is called your HPA axis. This is a hormone axis that is essentially determines your body's response to threat. So your hypothalamus sends a signal for hormone release. Your pituitary gland releases an initial rush of hormones and sends a signal for additional release, which goes to your adrenal system and releases all of these huge floods of hormones into your body to prepare you to combat whatever the threat is that's coming at you. So think of a time where you've been scared or startled. You heard a noise in your apartment or your house in the middle of the night. You were walking in the woods in nature and you saw a snake. You almost got into a car crash because you were driving on I-40 in Nashville and people are crazy, whatever it may be. You know this feeling. We all have experienced it at least once in our lives. This rush of tension, your heart is pounding, you may get dry mouthed, your breath is coming faster and faster. Adrenaline is racing through your body, so you may feel shaky, you may feel dizzy, you may feel like your heart is pounding or fluctuating. You may get hot. You may feel a fluttering or churning sensation in your stomach. Your muscles may feel tense and then feel weak and watery in the aftermath. All of these things are products of the hormone release and brain response to trauma. So if you recognize what I'm talking about when I say if you're scared, you feel kind of a swooping, fluttering feeling in your stomach. Again, think of a time where you've been scared or maybe you've been watching a horror movie. What that feeling actually is blood moving away from your digestive system, which is a non-essential system during panic, during fight time. So it's your blood moving away from your digestive system into your limbs to prepare you for a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so the same thing happens in your brain. When the alarm systems go off and your body says, yes, this is something that is right for me to be scared about, the same thing happens in your brain. So in the immediate aftermath of fear, your body can go down a couple of different pathways. So again, let's go back to my ice machine embarrassing story. Let's say something like that happens to you and you follow the sound and you figure out it's just an old ice machine that's dumping ice into kind of an empty freezer and causing a loud, echoey sound. Your body is going to calm down it might take a minute or two depending on how startled you were and how big of a scaredy cat you are. But you're going to settle and you're going to calm. But if you hear a noise in your apartment and then you start to see shadows under your door and hear talking and realize someone's broken in, then your body is going to start preparing you for fight, flight, or freeze. So the same thing that happens to your digestive system happens in your brain. The blood moves from your non-essential brain systems, which in the case of panic and trauma and fear is that frontal cortex that sorry guys, that decision-making cognitive part of your brain, and blood moves into the limbic system, the emotional, panic, but also survival instinct system of your brain. And your body is, again, flooded with hormones. So lots and lots of hormones exist in your body, and lots of hormones exist during stress or trauma, but the four major categories of hormones that are released in your body during stress, trauma, and fear are catecholamines, which are your body's natural adrenaline, cortisol or corticosteroids, which is your body's natural energy, and kind of energy flow system, opioid peptides, which are your body's natural narcotics, and oxytocin, which is sometimes called the love hormone. It's a hormone that you hear talked a lot of times about in the immediate aftermath of birth. A lot of oxytocin is released in breastfeeding mothers, and that is also one of the things that's released during stress and trauma. So I would like to hear your opinion real quick, and just type it in your chat box. Which of these 4 hormones or 4 categories of hormones do you think seems out of place? Which of these guys seems like a weird thing for your body to release during fear and trauma? Yeah, immediately Allie says oxytocin. Absolutely. Oxytocin is definitely the weird one. So why do you think that your body might release oxytocin during stress, fear, or trauma? If you have an idea, let me know in the chat box. I'll give you a couple seconds to answer. Why do you think oxytocin might be released during stress, fear, or trauma? You all are sharp. Lots of right answers right off the bat. Absolutely. So yes, so just like you might imagine, opioids are released in the body to combat physical pain, so injuries. So like you may have been in a car accident or talked to someone who was in a car accident who said, I felt kind of numb. I didn't even realize I was hurt till I looked down and saw that I was bleeding. So that is what opioids do. And oxytocin is released in order to calm you emotionally. So to calm you down, to try to level you out and get you as focused as you can be in this situation and help you to survive. Now, all of these hormones are wonderful and amazing things, and they're part of our body's survival instincts, which are hugely important and cannot be understated. And these hormones also cause us a lot of problems. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that again in just a minute. First, we're going to remember when I mentioned that your body is preparing for fight, flight, and freeze. So these are instantaneous, instinctive responses to perceived threat. And these are, by and large, determined by a few things. They are determined by your past experiences with trauma, potentially with military training or other types of repetitive training. Hey, Jessica, yeah, I can see your answer. Thank you. And the other thing that determines fight, flight, or freeze is our hormone releases and how our body responds to those hormones. So if you have, for instance, a huge spike in catecholamines and cortisol, you're probably going to be ready to either fight or flight. Your energy's up, your adrenaline's up, you're ready to go. If you have a crash, a bottoming out of your cortisol, but you have a large spike in opioids in your system, that may cause more of a freeze response. And so one of my very favorite visualizations of the fight or flight response is this little GIF that I'm getting ready to show you. It's something that you all might have seen before, but it's a couple of little kids, and they look to be, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and they step into kind of a darkened hallway, and there's a little creepy doll figure standing at the end of the hallway that their parents put there as kind of a teasing joke, and this is what happens. They both step into the hallway, and one of them runs away, and the other one runs straight for the doll and is just going to get rid of it. And so this is the thing about our fight or flight responses, is it's a very immediate, instantaneous response that we make to try to save ourselves in whatever way our brain and body decides is the best and most effective way in that moment. And so fight, flight, and freeze is not something that you can consciously choose. There are ways that you can overwrite your natural response. So for instance, if you have military training or law enforcement training, that is repetitive training that kind of automates the responses for you to have during a scary or violent situation, then you can override that natural fight, flight, or freeze response in order to enact your training for long enough to kind of snap out of that immediate brain reaction. But if you've never had some of that training, or if you're in a situation that just overwhelms your system entirely, fight, flight, or freeze response is a reflex, almost just like blinking or breathing. It is a response that you don't choose. And so the freeze response is often the one that we forget. When we talk about fight or flight, it's very common for us to say, you know, our fight or flight response, and we forget that there is a third option. It's the freeze response. It is often called tonic immobility, and it's for trauma-induced paralysis. And it is also such a common response to sexual violence that you will occasionally hear it called rape-induced paralysis. And so if you are familiar with driving at night in a more rural area and having a deer cross the road and just utterly freeze in front of your car, then you are familiar with tonic immobility. Another good example of tonic immobility, and something that you might have seen on the internet, are those fainting goats. Those little bitty goats that if you startle them, they freeze and fall over. That is called tonic immobility. It's when our system is flooded and overwhelmed with too much information, too many hormones, too much fear, and we freeze. Also, what happens when our body and brain are convinced that we are going to die if we don't freeze. It's why animals freeze or play possum. And many times, if you've worked with victims of rape, sexual assault, or molestation, they may tell you What happened to me felt like an out-of-body experience, like I was on the outside looking in and I couldn't move and I couldn't do anything about it. Where they may tell you, I wanted to scream, I wanted to yell, I wanted to fight, and nothing happened. And so what happens to them in that case is tonic immobility or a freeze response. And because we are so unfamiliar with the freeze response and we talk about it so little, you often have people very much blaming themselves for freezing in these traumatic, scary, dangerous situations. Again, with the example of sexual assault, one of the things that you hear most often in media, in news, even in like movies and TV shows about this topic, you hear things like, well, why didn't she just fight or run or yell? And the victims internalize that blame, and they also don't understand why they didn't fight or run or yell. So one of the reasons that I think it's so desperately important for us to understand our brain and body's reaction to trauma is that when we are working with someone in a professional role, or when we know someone in our family or a friend, a loved one who's experienced this, we are able to tell them, this is why it happened, and you didn't choose this, and you didn't do anything wrong. It's not your fault. It's what your body did to try to help you survive. And so again, back to those wonderful hormones that help us survive traumatic events, they can also have a really detrimental, deteriorating aspect. So cortisol in particular, the corticosteroids that I talked to you about, cortisol is a hormone that regulates the energy and the release of other hormones in our body and tries to restore us to homeostasis. But there are effects of the buildup of excess cortisol in our body, and what is called adrenal fatigue, where hormones are releasing over and over and over within our bodies, and having a long-term negative health impact. The choices made for us by our brains and bodies affect our trauma recovery. So again, understanding freezing, right? Understanding that our hormones can have an impact on how we respond. So I want to go back for just a second and talk a little bit more about this hormone response. So we've talked about the long-term negative effects of excess buildup of cortisol, but I want to talk about the immediate impacts of these hormone releases in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event. So let's say that you are driving down a highway. It's not super late at night, but it's getting dark. And up ahead of yourself, you witness a crash. Two cars crash into each other. They spin around. They're able to kind of spin across to the side of the highway and come to a stop. And because you witnessed the crash, you pull over and you get out, you call police, you go to see if everybody's okay. One of the people driving one of the cars It's injured and shaken, but seems all right. A little panicky, but generally what you would expect after a crash. The other person stumbles out of their car, appears to be in a daze. Their face is blank and not upset. They're looking around like they don't understand what happened. And then they just sit on the ground beside their car and stare. You might initially assume, as might a lot of people coming on the scene, that that person may be drunk or high. But that could also be the very real impact of a flood of opioid peptides into our system. Opioid peptides not only numb our physical pain, but have, to a degree, the same impact on our immediate emotional state as taking an opiate painkiller would. It makes us a little dazed, a little far away, and gives a flat affect, so we don't seem to have any emotional response to what's happening around us. Let's say the same situation happened and the person got out of the car giggling, swaying, smiling, and dropped down to sit on the ground, kind of giggling to themselves and seeming dazed and out of it. Again, you might very seriously think that this person has been drinking. But that also may be the impact of a huge surge of oxytocin into their system. If you are the type of person who is a nervous laugher or a nervous smiler, and you find yourself smiling in tense and inappropriate situations and you can't really help it, a lot of us do that or know someone who does that. That is, to a much lesser degree, an impact of oxytocin release. So you're familiar. And again, if you were a first responder or somebody who came upon the scene of these accidents, your initial instincts might be able to judge these folks and assume that they were drunk or high or driving under the influence. And going into a much more serious example, if you are a first responder called to a scene to investigate a rape allegation and the victim was smiling or seemed unnaturally calm and had no emotional response, you may assume that they're not telling the truth about what happened to them. And so that's why I think it's so important to talk about the choices made for us by our brains and bodies to help us survive trauma can have a severe impact on our recovery from trauma, the ways that we blame ourselves and internalize, and the way that those around us may judge what has happened to us and the impact on us. So our next step is to move into talking a little bit about trauma and memory. But before we do that, I want to give some space for questions. So I am going to give just a minute or two for anybody who has questions about anything we've talked about so far. Please put those in the chat box, and I'll try to answer them if you have any. how does the age of the person at the time of trauma impact treatment modalities? That's a great question. So the age of a person at the time of the trauma impacts every aspect of the trauma, not just treatment modalities. It impacts how the trauma will be perceived, how the trauma will be internalized, and how we need to help the person heal. And so on one hand, if we're talking specifically about treatment modalities, there are some types of therapy that are simply not appropriate or helpful to children. And that's why it's so incredibly important when you're working with children who have experienced trauma to make sure that any treatment provider, any mental health provider that you are connecting them with is someone who has very specific training on working with children. One second. I'm going to apologize if my voice does anything crazy today, because I think every time I step outside, the pollen in the air just immediately swarms to me and tries to kill me. So another question that we've had is there a learned response to trauma? Does someone who has experienced several traumatic events deal with new trauma better than someone experiencing their first? So that is an excellent question. We are going to dig in a little bit more later on in the presentation to what is called chronic trauma. But what I will say is it very much depends on the person. If you are someone who's experienced several traumatic events, but they are, number one, different types of events, number two, natural or expected traumas, so things like a death in the family, a natural disaster, even divorce of a parent to a degree. And if you are someone who has a good support system and has been able to be supported by loved ones and potentially even professionals in the aftermath, then you are going to deal with new trauma much better than someone who, for instance, has experienced repeated sexual violence who has not had a good support system in place. So it's so subjective. It really depends, again, on the person, on the type of trauma, and on the type of support they receive as to how they deal with it. But having a positive healing process from trauma can increase your resilience and ability to deal with future trauma. And yes, you will get the slides for the presentation, so don't worry about that. How do we know if therapists in rural counties are using these practices? I assume you mean practices like treatment specialized toward children. So that's how I'm going to answer. And really, the best way to figure that out is to ask them what their specific specialties are. And any good therapist worth their salt should be more than happy to talk you through what areas of expertise they have and what treatment modalities that they use. Question, does good trauma, such as buying a new house, have the same effects on the brain as bad trauma? Okay, so that is a great question, but the answer is there is no such thing as good trauma. There is such a thing as good stress and bad stress. So buying a house would be good stress. But trauma is inherently a negative impact. So yes, in terms of good stress and bad stress, they have very different effects on the brain and body. Good stress is something that we actually need for optimal performance in our lives because it allows us to build resilience and also challenges us in very positive ways. Bad stress, things like overwhelming stress, like a death in the family, which can also be traumatic, but maybe not be traumatic, can have some of the same impacts of trauma. So just maybe not to as high of a degree. But, you know, even the bad stress, quote unquote, of going on a nature walk and being confronted with a snake or a bear on the path, that might not traumatize me, but it's going to have the same initial impact on my brain and body as an actually traumatizing event in terms of the same survival instincts getting triggered. Next question is, do individuals who have cognitive impairments that experience trauma also experience impairments in hormone release? I think impairments in hormone release is the wrong word, but they may have marked differences in hormone release because they are likely not to experience trauma in the exact same way. And it's going to depend on them, but what I will say is they may experience trauma much more acutely than we would, than someone without a cognitive impairment, or depending on what their particular impairment is, they may be slightly more removed from the trauma. Will you be talking about night terrors in relation to trauma? Yes, I will touch on it, but if I don't answer whatever your specific question about it is, please ask again. Are there any precipitating factors which would make someone more prone to fight or flight? Also, what methods can help retrain a fight or flight response? Great question. So precipitating factors which can make someone more prone to fight or flight, that can be like what I mentioned before, military or law enforcement training. That can be, a lot of times it's really just a function of their specific personality and their own internalized fears, right? So again, like I said, fight and flight and freeze are not conscious decisions that we make, but our brain definitely responds in ways that are sort of in line with our fears. So me, for instance, my first instinct when I hear a noise in my apartment, like the crazy ice machine, is to go investigate, which is technically a fight response. But my first instinct and my first response when I see a spider in my apartment is to freeze and then run away. So those are very dependent on my particular fears and biases. Things that can help you retrain those responses, those are, again, things like military training, law enforcement training, but also things like martial arts training and self-defense classes, but with the caveat that it takes a long time to retrain those responses, so you can't take just one self-defense class or even just one or two and expect you to be retrained. Could traumatic events lead to a person developing anxiety or panic attacks? Would you say this is from not handling the trauma? Yes, it can and often does lead them to develop anxiety or panic attacks, and I will be going into much more detail about this as we move forward. So I'm going to have you hold on to that question, and then if I don't fully answer it, ask me again. Let's see. Can a bad support system stop a person from recovery from trauma? It can certainly highly delay it. It will probably, it can be a factor in stopping recovery, but it definitely and almost always delays recovery. Is it a bad idea to try to help the traumatized person realize more quickly what is going on after the trauma? And is it even possible to help them react more quickly if most of the reaction is based on hormones? So this is a great question. And what I want to say is, in the midst of trauma, most of the time they are reacting very quickly in terms of fight, flight, or freeze. That is an almost instantaneous response. I know me talking about the whole process of hormone release and the HPA axis made it seem like it takes several minutes, but it's actually a very quick response in your body. And so I think what you're asking is, if someone, for instance, freezes in the face of trauma, can you kind of snap them out of it? And yes, you can. So for instance, if you're with a friend and you're walking with them through the woods and you see a bear, the friends may totally freeze, and you may be ready to get out of there. And so you can kind of grab them, pull them, they will snap out of it, because you're pulling them away from the source of trauma, right? But things like that flat affect I talked about, or the kind of nervous smiling and things that are impacts of the hormone release, those really just have to cycle their way through your body. It's just like, again, like taking an opiate painkiller. There's no way to speed up the process of your body metabolizing it. It just has to work its way through. I'm going to do one more question, and then I'm going to move on, but I'll take more questions later. I just don't want to push us ending too late. So how does a first responder then differentiate the natural opiate release from what appears to be under the influence of alcohol or some other illicit drugs that may have causative factors in the accident? Another excellent question. Number one, most first responders are trained in trauma response, and more commonly these days, first responders are getting better training on trauma response. And so they kind of, even if their first impression is this person may be drunk or high, once they interact a little bit with them beyond the first impressions, there are going to be some ways that they're going to be able to see, for instance, not smelling alcohol, looking at different body reactions, and, you know, especially in a traffic stop or a wreck, they may still end up blood testing them. But with more trauma training, it is my hope, and the hope I think of many other folks who do this type of training, that the more people understand trauma, the less they're going to stereotype these reactions, but it does still happen. Okay, so I promise I will answer more questions later, but I'm going to get us back into the groove of our presentation. And thank you all for your questions. There's some really great thoughts, and I appreciate it. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of trauma on our memories. So our normal day-to-day memory, this is called declarative memory. So declarative memory is just the memory of what happens to you throughout a normal day, your average memory. Declarative memory typically has pretty good sense of space and time and chronological order. Nobody's memory is perfect, but declarative memory usually has at least some kind of sense of flow, and declarative memory is encoded within your frontal cortex, that front part of your brain that has all of those great, cause and effect, thinking of consequences, all of those pieces of your brain. So it's encoded in the frontal cortex and consolidated in the hippocampus. So when I say encoding, the best way to think of it is when you open a Word document on your computer, encoding is actually typing words into that document. So you're putting information in, and the information that you're typing, let's say you're typing an agenda for a meeting. The information that you're typing has times, and it goes in a very specific order, and it makes sense, and it's consolidated or stored. So think of that like saving your Word document into a file on your computer. It's consolidated and stored in the hippocampus, right? But let's say you have a traumatic incident. You have the physiological reactions that we were talking about earlier. Your HPA axis activates. You have all of that hormone release. And remember what I mentioned, blood is pulled from non-essential systems, your frontal cortex, and it's pulled into the limbic system of your brain. So you no longer have the ability to type into your Word document, your frontal cortex. Now you've got to do it somewhere else. So the encoding in traumatic memory happens in the amygdala. And remember, the amygdala is that emotional alarm system of your brain. So your amygdala is kind of a drama queen. Your amygdala comes with all of these super heightened emotional responses. And the main purpose of your amygdala is not storing memories. It's great at a lot of things, but it's not so great at that. And then they are consolidated and stored in both the amygdala and the hippocampus. So think about the work you do every day, the jobs that you do, and what you use your computers for. You're typically typing and storing files in certain places on your computer. And if one day you have a very important meeting and you have to leave that meeting and you can't be taking notes, so instead of you and your Word document, the frontal cortex system, keeping those notes, you hand it off to an intern who does some kind of like typing in one of the programs that the youth use, like TikTok or something. I don't know, I'm old. And they store it, they save it not in the normal place you save things in your computer. Somewhere in your computer, but not in the normal spot. It's going to be much more challenging for you later to go back and retrieve that document and make sense of it when it's both written and stored in a very different way than what you're used to. And that's what traumatic memory is like. It's both written and stored in different places in your brain than what you're used to, and it's much more challenging to access. And all of these amazing hormones that, again, are helping you survive unfortunately have a long-term negative impact on your memory. If you have regular excessive releases of catecholamine, cortisol, and opioids particularly, those hormones can damage your brain in your long-term memory centers on a cellular level. And that is something that folks who struggle with chronic trauma, like victims of trafficking, victims of child abuse, victims of domestic violence, folks who are in active duty combat, have to struggle with. And then in some cases, upsetting emotions, because remember I told you that our memories are stored in those emotional centers sometimes now and not just their normal storage bin. In some cases, upsetting, disturbing bodily emotions and sensations can exist in our implicit memory without access to the information and context in which they arose or what they're about. So our implicit memory, remember, our normal day-to-day memory is declarative memory. Implicit memory is memory of things that are habits or routines. Things like tying your shoes, writing your name, locking your door behind you every day when you leave. Things that you do over and over and over again and you can do on autopilot without thinking about it. And so sometimes memories of our trauma get wrapped up in implicit or habit memory. And habit memory doesn't allow us really to see the memory the way that we can do with declarative memory. Habit memory in these types of cases are very emotion, sensation based. They're what is called somatic memories. And so let's give an example of a victim of sexual assault whose perpetrator happened to be wearing a red Braves t-shirt when they committed the assault. This isn't a thing that the victim has particularly committed to declarative memory. It's not something that stood out to them because they were much more focused and worried about the actual assault, but it is something that the amygdala absorbed and encoded somewhere in their brain. So later on, that person may be walking down the street, they've gone out to the cute little downtown area of the place where they lived, and they're walking down the street doing a little shopping, and a person passes them in a red Braves t-shirt, and they don't think twice about it. But in that moment, suddenly they're feeling panic. They're feeling fear. Their heart is pounding. Their blood is pumping. Their palms are sweating. They feel a little nauseous. They're not connecting it to necessarily, they might have not even noticed in their conscious mind the Brave t-shirt. But the amygdala, the alarm system, they noticed the Brave t-shirt. It set off a danger signal. And now you have the person who is being triggered, who's had an emotional trigger, and are feeling some of those same fear and panic sensations from the initial assault happening within them in this moment on this street where everything 5 seconds ago was fine. And so that is how our brains can sometimes store some of these traumatic memories. So it becomes very confusing for the trauma victim, both trying to access the memories and put them in any kind of normal, chronological, sensical order, and dealing with potentially really unexpected triggers that they may not be able to identify. So remember, just a reminder, the consequences of trauma vary greatly depending on the age, the nature of trauma, the victim's history, all of that good stuff. So we're going to move forward into some impact of chronic fear, okay? And so chronic fear or chronic trauma is what I mentioned earlier when we are talking about the ways in which someone may experience repeated trauma over time. So child abuse, molestation, domestic violence, things like that, repeated trauma over time. Number one, you end up with conditioned responses. So we talked earlier, and some folks asked earlier about ways to break your body or retrain your body to do something other than what would be your normal fight or flight response. And I told you some, healthy, productive ways to do that, but there's also this terrible, scary way to do that, which is conditioned responses in the aftermath of abuse. So a conditioned response goes something like this. Your normal response to domestic violence, to a violent incident within your home, may be flight. So you try to run, you try to hide, you try to curl up and protect yourself. But your perpetrator may say, I want you to stand here and look at me in the eye when I'm talking to you. And they may grab you by the arm and yank you up and make you look at them. And over time, you may realize that if you don't do that, the violence that they inflict on you is much, much worse. So you conditioned over time to stand and stare at your attacker when they become angry and belligerent and violent. And so that is a type of conditioned response. Another type of conditioned response is a type of trigger. So I mentioned triggers a minute ago when I gave the example of you're walking down the street, you see the Braves t-shirt, you get that somatic response. Triggers have become such a common and overused word that to a degree they have lost all meaning. But when we're talking about behavioral, emotional, and mental health triggers, what we're talking about is something that triggers a memory, flashback, or otherwise emotional or physiological response in us from a traumatic event. Okay? And so I'm going to give you an example of a girl that I worked with a very long time ago. And she was, back when I worked in domestic violence shelter services, which was like a decade ago, when she first started calling our agency, she was in that sort of hard place where she was a little too old for some traditional children's services, but she was too young at 16 years old to receive our services without being either emancipated or receiving services with the accompaniment of her guardian. Her abuser was her parent, and although reports were made, there was never enough evidence for her to be removed from the home, I'll put it that way. So the day that she turned 18, she had a safety plan in place. She had worked with us. She immediately came to our shelter, and she was a wonderful client. She ended up getting into community college and working her way through college and really getting back on her feet. She was remarkably resilient. And one day, a few years later, after she was well out of shelter and really well past receiving our services, she called the agency having a full-blown panic attack. And it turns out what had happened was she had moved into her first home. She previously lived in apartments and things with roommates, but she'd moved into the first house that she'd ever lived in besides her parents' house with her partner. And they had been unpacking some things and doing kind of those normal move-in things, and he'd gone to get some lunch. And when he came back, he hit the garage door opener, and they hadn't used the garage yet, but he wanted to pull in and unload some stuff, so he hit the garage door opener. And when she heard, and if you've ever been in a home with a garage door opener, you know it makes a very distinct kind of grinding, rumbling sound. And when she heard that sound, it completely triggered a response from her from when she had been a child. And she always knew when she heard the sound of the garage door opener, that meant her mom was home and she needed to hide. She needed to be in her room, closed in her room, door locked, to be safe. So when she heard this, she was completely thrown back into that moment unexpectedly. She ran, she locked herself in one of the bathrooms, crying, having a panic attack, and called us. So that is another type of conditioned responses, those ingrained trauma triggers and things that we may not even realize. The creation of synaptic pathways. So the idea of things that fire together, wire together. You're creating pathways in your brain between a behavior and a response that become ingrained in us over time. Repeated physical, mental, and emotional damage. So again, you are at a higher risk of mental health issues the more that you experience chronic trauma. You are at a higher risk of physical, long-term physical health issues, not only things like what I talked about at the beginning, like fibromyalgia and chronic pain disorders, insomnia, night terrors, but you're also things like repeated head trauma, right? We know now from sports, and particularly football, the damage of repeated head trauma. But when you are in a particularly violent chronic trauma situation, you are in danger of experiencing some of those symptoms of repeated trauma. If you are somebody who is pulled, dragged, yanked by arms during the course of your trauma, you may develop arthritis in joints over time. You may develop chronic pain issues, chronic mental health issues, and you're increasing the risk of harmful coping mechanisms like drug use, alcohol use, etc. And part of the reason that you're increasing that risk of harmful coping mechanisms is in response to that trauma, that hormone release. So if you are having a huge spike of adrenaline in the middle of the night because your abuser has initiated a violent incident, you may not be able to get any sleep that night, and you may be exhausted, and you know that you have to work because you're the only one bringing in money in the household to pay the bills. So you may take pills Adderall or something to give you more energy. You may start having to drink or take other kinds of substances to help you sleep, to help you deal with chronic pain, to help you just regulate your emotional systems overall. You may start self-harming as a way to control the pain that you're experiencing and express the pain. So lots of these harmful coping mechanisms are responses to try to self-regulate a system which has completely been thrown into chaos because of the violence that you're experiencing. And so in the aftermath of trauma, even if it's not chronic trauma, you're going to see three main kind of groups of or categories of responses. It's what we call the trauma triad: hyperarousal, constriction, and intrusion. And the thing about the trauma triad is that they all feed into each other, and they can all be happening in conjunction with each other. So hyperarousal, sometimes called hypervigilance, this is that exaggerated startle response. So this is somebody who is jittery, who is constantly anxious, who is constantly worried, maybe even to the point of seeming paranoid, shaky, jittery, jumping and startling at the smallest thing. This is the person who's always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always waiting for the next bad thing to happen, always looking over their shoulder. And with hyperarousal, the thing is it wears out your body very quickly. So they may cycle between periods of intense hyperarousal and then periods of depressed exhaustion where they just cannot get out of bed and function. Then you have intrusion. Intrusion is partly the trigger response. Intrusion is intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories, the somatic emotions that you don't really know where they're coming from. This is also things like night terrors. So you may have managed to push away and push away and push away thoughts during the daytime, but your whole subconscious is focused on the trauma, and so it's coming out in the form of nightmares and night terrors, which also means you're not sleeping very well, you're more exhausted during the day, and the more exhausted you are, the more susceptible you are to triggers and intrusive thoughts. When our brains are tired, they're more susceptible to those things. And so it becomes this cycle. And then that kind of leads to constriction. You become fearful not only of the trauma itself and the next shoe that might drop, but you also become fearful of your own reactions to trauma, the night terrors, the triggers, the re-experiencing memories, and so you start to withdraw. You start to find excuses not to go places you would normally go. You miss work, you miss school, you're exhausted, you stop answering your phone when friends call you, you isolate yourself in an effort of self-protection. And again, so you can kind of see how all three of these work together and build off of each other in the aftermath of trauma. Additional reactions may be things like Your ability to orient to safety and danger are way out of whack. For a few different reasons. Number one, because you may be having some of those somatic emotion feelings. So like going back to the example of walking down the street, seeing the red t-shirt and having that reaction, you may, in not knowing what caused the reaction, not realizing it was the red t-shirt, you may decide there's something on this street, there's something about this, downtown square, there's something about this area that is triggering me, so I'm going to stay away from here because here's obviously the dangerous place. And so your ability to orient safety and danger, you're also, because you're potentially constantly on edge, constantly afraid, makes it much more difficult to trust those around you. And in the very immediate aftermath of trauma, while your frontal cortex is still kind of offline, that cause and effect and decision-making center, you may very literally have a very challenging time understanding the consequences of your actions and understanding where may be a safe place or a dangerous place to go. Your ability to self-regulate. So again, that's what I talked about when I mentioned many people try to regulate with drugs and alcohol because your body's own kind of self-regulation centers have been thrown off by trauma and hormone releases. And then your jumbled narratives, your jumbled memories. And a note that I think is really important about what we might call negative coping strategies. It's important to remember that every defense mechanism, even if it's drugs or alcohol, started out as a coping strategy in order to survive what they were going through. And so it may be detrimental, it may be negative in the long term, but it started out as a way to survive. And so what we need to do is turn that energy in toward a positive coping mechanism, whether that be cognitive behavioral therapy or digging back into hobbies and things, or finding a way to, in a more natural way, regulate your sleep cycle. But it's also important to remember that we can't let go of our coping mechanisms, no matter how negative they may be, until we are in a safe place to do so. So if we are still in the abusive relationship, if we are still in the home where we are being molested, if we are still on the battlefield, we can't put down our negative coping mechanisms when they are still needed to survive. So what if you take nothing else from this, I want you to take away this. A victim's willingness to engage the system and their welcome and response from the system is impacted by how they're responding to trauma. So if they are in that hypervigilance stage where they are anxious and jittery and they may be aggressive and angry and snapping because they haven't slept in 2 days, they're less likely to get a positive response from folks they're reaching out to for help. And so we could talk about generational trauma all day, but we're going to skip that for today. That could be a whole conversation unto itself. But I want to really, for a quick minute before we go to final questions, I want to dig into this idea of a positive response to trauma. So think about first, I think very helpful is the acronym GRACE. Gather your attention, focus yourself on to the person that you're working with or the family member or loved one or whoever it is. Recall your intention or motivation. If you're a professional in a field, whether it's education or whether you're an advocate or work specifically with victims of trauma like I do, it can be very daunting and very exhausting, and you can feel some of that secondary trauma. So one of the things that helps us focus on being the best support we can to that person is recalling our own intention and motivation and reason for doing the work. Attuning to yourself and the client. And what I mean by that is making sure you're paying attention to those nonverbal cues where you might need a break, you might need to step away, or the client may be getting triggered or upset and may need a breather before you keep going. Considering what will serve the client, that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, that trauma impacts everyone differently. Engaging ethically and ending ethically. So engaging ethically is things like, you know, even if you're not a mental health professional and even if your profession doesn't necessarily have an edict around confidentiality, in ethical work still demands that we keep someone's trauma history confidential. And ethical ending means that we are not here to make people dependent on us. We are here to help them grow and heal and become empowered within themselves. So a great guide to dig more into this is SAMHSA's 6 Guiding Principles to a Trauma-Informed Approach. But the link here, and again, you will get a copy of these slides, but safety is both physically and emotionally safe, so somebody cannot, again, begin healing until they're safe. And making sure that you're challenging your own biases. We all have biases, and especially when we're talking about things like sexual assault and the way it's portrayed in the media, it can be very easy to fall in victim-blaming traps. So really challenge the way that we perceive victims of trauma and the biases that we may have. Encourage the peer support opportunities, because peer support is a huge piece of resilience and healing. Prioritize client needs over what your opinion is as to what's best. Avoid blame-based questions, like why didn't you leave sooner or why didn't you get help sooner, and instead ask things like what brought you here. Help make a plan not just for safety, but for hope, for what the future might bring beyond the trauma. Consider cultural barriers to help seeking, things like language barriers, fear of social systems, and things like an oasis, an anchor, and a safe space. So an oasis is something that can successfully distract a trauma survivor from the memories of the trauma. So it may be a movie, a song, a game, an activity, a book, but it's something tangible and something that holds only positive associations that can distract them in the moment from the trauma they're experiencing. An anchor is a person, place, or thing that holds, again, positive associations that they can think about or picture if they're starting to maybe have a panic attack or feel anxiety or fear. They can focus on the memory of that thing. And then a safe space is a very real physical space, whether it's at home, at school, or anywhere that they're spending a lot of time, at the office, where if something happens that does trigger them or they are feeling anxious, or they are feeling some of those somatic responses, they can go to that physical space and know that they are safe. So again, you're going to receive all of these resources. So I'm not going to belabor them because you guys, I've seen lots of questions coming in, so I want to definitely take time to answer as many as I can. And if you have additional questions, type them again in the chat box. And if you have a question that you either don't want to ask on the training that's a little sensitive, or maybe you think is going to take too much time, or that you just you know, want to ask me privately, you can always email me. My email and my contact information is on the screen. So we'll give folks a few minutes to answer questions or to ask questions. And we'll get to absolutely as many as we can. And again, if I don't get to you or you think of something later or don't want to ask it, please feel free to email.
Heather, do you mind if Christy jumps on for just a minute, and for folks that need to go ahead and get off, and I have a few questions that I've been holding, and if I send you one that you've already answered, please disregard, but.
Perfect.
Well, thank you, Heather, again, for such a phenomenal presentation today. I know I always find it fascinating for receiving information about the brain, and just an excellent job in walking us through that information today. So thank you again. On behalf of all the regional coordinators, we would like to thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you for future offerings. Many of you may have also registered for the psychological effects of social distancing and quarantine on children next Tuesday, May 11th, with Dr. Tim Perry. This offering has reached capacity for registration. However, it will be recorded. All recordings will be available on our TCCY website. That's www.tn.gov/TCCY under videos next week. As a reminder, if you're calling in today, please email me at christy.paling@tn.gov, your name and phone number if you need a participant or a CEU certificate. All attendees will be receiving an email next week with certificates and membership information about joining our local councils. So again, we thank you so much for being here with us today. Have a great week. And for those of you who are able to stay for some questions and answers, please do so. And again, we look forward to seeing you in future offerings. I'll turn it back over to you, Heather and Jill, for our question and answer period.
Heather, are you getting the ones I'm sending?
Yeah.
Would you want me to read them? Good.
That might be easier. I don't know if I am caught up in the chat. So if you want to read the ones you've got, that might make it a little bit easier.
And just let me know if you've answered these, because I sometimes miss what you're answering if I'm trying to capture other questions. Is there a way to train your brain or body to regulate the hormone release in recovery?
That is a great question, and unfortunately the answer is no. That is a completely automated physiological response that maybe in the future we might be able to do more in terms of regulating those hormone releases, but right now we are just subject to our bodies, unfortunately.
And did you address the flight, fight, or freeze? Is there some clinical reason that makes someone more apt to flight, fight, or freeze in response to trauma?
You know, depression may have an impact on that. Anxiety may have an impact on that, but really it's fight, flight, or freeze is such a you know, your brain is really a fascinating organ, and it takes in so much information, and fight, flight, or freeze is really the product of so many different pieces of input, from your hormones to past experiences to brain chemistry to, you know, what injuries you may have sustained. All kinds of things kind of pile up to inform that.
Thank you. How soon after a traumatic event should an individual seek out counseling services?
That's a really excellent question, and it's different for everyone. And for me, in my personal opinion, is that there is no such thing as too soon, as long as you feel ready to talk about it. Everybody's going to be different. Somebody may feel ready to talk about it that very next day, and somebody may take a little bit longer to be ready to talk about it. But, you know, counseling not only helps with managing the symptoms and the impact of trauma, but can really help you talk through what happened to you and understand it better.
Thank you. Does the increase in hormone-related conditions, example PCOS, negatively impact individuals' ability to respond to and/or deal with traumatic events?
That's a great question. That's a really good question. So it's not necessarily going to impact their ability to respond. What it's going to impact is the cocktail of hormones that are released. So it's important to understand that while the hormones that we talked about today are the most common ones that are released, even if you and I had the same exact 3 or 4 hormones released in our bodies, they're going to be released at different levels depending on every person and our own physiology. So if you have some kind of hormonal issues such as PCOS or other types of hormonal imbalances, what that might do is it may lessen or prevent the release of certain hormones while increasing the release of others. So that is going to impact how you respond to violence or trauma, but the aftermath, your healing process, is not going to necessarily be impacted.
Thank you. And how do you break through to get a younger openly share regarding a trauma when they seem to have just been pushed, when they seem to have just pushed it down?
That's a great question. So one of the modalities that I have seen the most effective in the young children who are suppressing trauma is art therapy. Any kind of art therapy, because what art therapy often does is it kind of comes in to that traumatic experience from a different angle. It's not having the child have to express it or tackle it head on. A lot of times kids don't have the language of emotion that we do to really talk about it, or it can seem very overwhelming and scary. So the thing that art therapy does very, very well is allows the child to express and get emotions out in a different way, to start slowly releasing the buildup of fear and trauma, and sort of releasing some of that pressure without having to tackle it head on right away, if that makes sense. So look into art therapy modalities, people who are in your area that are trained on using art therapy with kiddos. I think it's a really good and often very successful treatment.
Thank you. Is there a generational trauma training that you have?
Yes, I do have training on historical and generational trauma. And if you want to email me about any kind of other training, for your organization or a local training or a local webinar, as it may be right now, just shoot me an email and I can talk to you about kind of what we can put together.
Thank you. Is grief considered to be a trauma?
It can be. Absolutely. Grief, particularly the loss of a loved one, can be a very traumatic experience. And again, it's going to depend on the person, but yes, absolutely.
And would you care to share your thoughts on EMDR therapy? Do you want to define that for folks that may not know what EMDR is?
So EMDR is a therapy modality, and I cannot for the life of me remember what it stands for right now because you've asked me, but it's a therapy modality that includes lots of physical touch and movement. And I have never been on the receiving end of EMDR, but I have worked with lots of clients who have had really great success with it. And for me, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Allie, you're amazing. Thank you. What I always think about kind of any therapy modality is if you're interested, try it out. If you're able, I totally know that not everybody is able to seek out therapy and mental health, or definitely seek out certain modalities in their area, depending on where they live. But everybody responds differently to different modalities, and some things that, you might hear people who love cognitive behavioral therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy is very, I want to say, kind of trending right now, because it's very easy to make those kind of great Pinterest graphics about cognitive behavioral therapy, writing exercises and emotional exercises, and they're easy things for people to do at home, and that doesn't make them bad. I have had great success with CBT, lots of people that I know have, but it may be something that's just not for you, and you may want a more touch or movement-based modality. So, and again, I know lots of people that it's worked brilliantly for. So I always say, learn about it, try it out, ask your current therapist. Even if they don't do that modality, chances are they're going to know someone who does and have good referrals for you.
Thank you. Is there an opening question or questions to ask to determine what may be considered to be a client's as a trigger? Do people always recognize their own triggers easily?
That's a great question, and the answer is people do not always recognize their own triggers easily. In fact, recognizing your own triggers is sometimes something that takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time to kind of untangle the web of things that may be triggering you. And one of the things that you can do to help someone kind of figure out what's triggering them is to have them walk backwards through an event. So think about the moment you were triggered and then walk me backwards through what happened before that and see if we can pinpoint it. But That being said, if you're going to help someone kind of walk through and start pinpointing their triggers, really have some grounding and de-escalation techniques in your back pocket, because the last thing you want is to cause a triggering response without a way to help that person ground and center and feel safe.
Thank you. Could times of increased hormone surging, such as menstruation, puberty, menopause, affect the hormone release and levels released due to negative stress and trauma?
Yeah, when kiddos are going through puberty, man, it throws everything off, and it can really heighten the feeling and experience of overwhelm and trauma in the face of negative events.
And you mentioned that depression and anxiety impact the flight, fight, or freeze response. Can you talk a little more about depression and anxiety roles in trauma? Is a client less likely to survive trauma if there is a depressive or anxiety disorder?
That's a great question. So what I would say is they are absolutely not less likely to survive by any means, but depression is, we know clinically, depression is at least in part for many people a function of serotonin regulation, for instance. So hormones impact depression and hormones impact our response to trauma. They can feed off each other, and depression can dampen the feelings of fear in the immediate event of trauma, but can prolong the healing process in the aftermath, because people who are struggling with depression already have a tendency toward internalizing shame. And so we know internalizing shame around trauma events, things that have happened to us, can prolong the healing process. So, you know, as with any other person who's experiencing trauma, they have clear paths to healing. Depression is not going to prevent them from healing, but it may make the journey more challenging.
And this one's from earlier. I want to make sure that you didn't, but could medications or pre-existing mental health issues affect individuals' response to trauma?
Yeah, I mean, again, that same kind of stuff, like if you're more anxious, and your anxiety, you may have a greater spike of kind of fear in the face of trauma. You may experience more of those hyperarousal symptoms in the aftermath of trauma if you already have anxiety or are predisposed to anxiety. If you're on certain medications for hormone regulation, that can change the way that your body releases hormones in that immediate response, so it can shift your response just depending on your body. But again, it's going to be very different for every person, so there's not an easy kind of black and white way for me to say this is exactly what's going to happen.
Thank you. Does trauma and resultant hormone response change with an individual with PDA?
It can. It can. And again, it just depends on that person. You know, I hesitate. I think these are all wonderful questions, but I hesitate to give you a definite yes or no on some of these, because there are so many other factors that are going to go into that person's individual response.
And I'm going to combine questions. Are there any signs to look for to notice a child that has experienced trauma? And what are treatments recommended for children?
Great. So signs of children who have experienced trauma, many times that can look like regressing into things that are that they had already grown out of. So things like bedwetting and other things that are not age appropriate. It can look like avoidance. It can look like often aggression, especially in younger children, aggression and frustration, because many younger children don't have a way to verbalize some of the overwhelming emotions they're experiencing. So they may, you know, in the presence of overwhelming kind of fear or anger or sadness, they may lash out as a way to try to express themselves. Nightmares and night terrors. Trying to avoid certain people or places. There can be lots of those kinds of symptoms, and some of those same symptoms in the trauma triad that we talked about with adults are also going to be present in kiddos as well. But definitely one of the biggest things that is pretty common is some of those like regression behaviors. And in terms of therapy modalities, you know, we already talked about art therapy, highly recommend. Really, therapy and treatment with children is very different than therapy and treatment with adults, because children often don't have the vocabulary to speak to their emotions, and the understanding of what their emotions actually are. Sometimes they feel overwhelming, but it's harder for them to put a name to. So really just look into folks who have a lot of specialization with treatment of children, and reach out to your local child advocacy center, even if the trauma the child experienced isn't related to abuse. The Child Advocacy Center will be able to give you some recommendations to providers in your area that specialize in therapy with kiddos.
Thank you. Can a bad support system stop a person from recovery from trauma?
It can delay it. I think I talked about this one earlier. It can certainly delay.
Trauma victim erase completely the incident and develop social phobias or any other behaviors that affect their lives. Yeah,
absolutely. So one of the functions of the way that trauma impacts memory is that they may not be able to access the memory of that event at all. So for instance, if you know somebody who's been in a bad car wreck, they'll often say, you know, I felt the jolt of impact, and then all of a sudden I'm, you know, upside down in my car and it's on the shoulder of the road and I don't know what happened between. And that is part of just like your brain didn't process that memory correctly, and you may never access it. So yeah, there is the possibility that they may have a complete blank spot there. There is the possibility that they may only remember pieces and parts of the traumatic event. It just all depends on their how their brain processes it. And in terms of those kind of behavioral responses, absolutely. Those can be things that are developed in the aftermath of trauma, yes.
And one more. Would you say that there is a lot? Would you say that there is a lot of shame and guilt around traumatized individuals' experience of how they have responded to trauma, fight, flight, or freeze?
Yes, and the type of trauma they've experienced has an impact on that. So, for instance, if the trauma they've experienced was a home invasion and they froze, they're less likely to have shame around that than if the experience was a sexual assault. Now, if there was a home invasion and they froze and one of their loved ones was hurt or killed, then you're talking about things where you're going to get the internalized shame of why didn't I do more. But the reason that people so often internalize shame around fight, flight, or freeze is because of some predisposition from society to judge those responses, right? So we talked about sexual assault, we talked about the idea. Can you guys hear me?
We can now.
Oh,
Your picture's gone.
Sorry, I think we glitched a little bit. So I don't know what all you heard from my response, but essentially what it boils down to is the shame that you may experience from a fight, flight, or freeze event comes at least in part from a societal judgment around that event. So sexual assault, for instance, if you are freezing during sexual assault, we all know we, have experienced media around, why didn't you run, why didn't you fight, etc. That can impact that that person, and people internalize that. Now, if it's an event like a home invasion where nobody but maybe you were injured and you froze, you're less likely to feel shame around that because there's not really the same societal judgment around that either. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think that is all of our questions. I hope I didn't miss any. I apologize if I did, but I think that I think I captured them all, or you did on your end. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you all for the great questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just a reminder, this was recorded. It should be on our website, as Christy mentioned earlier, by next week. And we thank you all for joining us. And some of you, I think, will be joining us next Monday for another presentation. But Heather, you have done wonderful. We can't thank you enough for your time and your great presentations. I don't know if you're seeing all of these, but so many people are just complimenting the great content and the great presenter you are. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. I'm glad to be here, and thanks, to everyone for your wonderful questions.
Hope everyone has a great day and a great rest of your week.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.